Resident Evil 3, the highly anticipated sequel to the critically acclaimed remake of Resident Evil 2. Ever since the remake of the original Resident Evil, fans like myself had been hoping for more remakes of the classic Resident Evil games, and with Resident Evil 2, Capcom definitely answered the hype. Though not without its issues, Resident Evil 2 was what Capcom needed after a steady decline in fan reception to the Resident Evil series. The reimagining of the game, along with the epic redesigns of iconic characters like Mr. X, G. Birkin, and even the regular zombies, placed the spotlight firmly back onto Capcom and Resident Evil. So naturally, when it was revealed they would release a remake of Resident Evil 3, the game that introduced the series' long-standing icon of the terrifying tyrant Nemesis, the hype train was quick to leave the station. Now that it's out, it's time to see if the hype train reached its destination, or if it completely derailed. I'm Sarkisukas, and this is the start of my 3 for 3 series, where I review games by explaining 3 things I liked about them, and 3 things I'd change to make them better. The first thing I immediately took a liking to was the beautiful setting of the apocalyptic city. The map designers have done a wonderful job of making Raccoon City feel like a real, expansive, lived-in city. It's the small details you can easily overlook that really bring the city to life. Though most of the areas you pass through are actually relatively small in terms of what can be accessed by the player, the layout of the city streets makes it all feel much larger than it actually is. The sound design goes a long way to achieving this as well, much like its predecessor. The addition of soundtracks from the original also generate that welcome prickle of nostalgia. This is one of the most aesthetically pleasing Resident Evil games, and this extends to the character designs. Though it's a shame that Julia Voth is no longer the face of Jill Valentine, Sasha Zotova has beauty and intensity to match. The redesign of Nemesis is also a highlight, modernising the iconic creature to be more mysterious at first, then terrifyingly hideous, before turning into a total monstrosity along with a brand new mutated form that wasn't in the original game. Of course, a game can be even more beautiful than the person you wish you could be with, but much like that person, it's all for nothing if it isn't functional. The game mechanics are the same as the Resident Evil 2 remake, but they're now far more polished. Picking up items is faster and smoother, no longer requiring the need to get a good look at that 100th box of handgun ammo. The inventory itself is quick and easy to manage with the same buttons as that of Resident Evil 5, which for me is good as it allows for muscle memory to kick in. The map serves as a useful guide not only for where you're going, but for any items you may have missed, which is helpful when caught in low health, only to discover a first aid spray you missed in that room just down the corridor. The newest and most important mechanic is the dodge mechanic, reimagined from the original, and it's a true lifesaver when in sticky situations. It requires practice to get the timing right, but once you have it down, you're rewarded with some slow motion, high damage opportunities, invaluable during boss fights or when outmaneuvering a horde of zombies. Though it's disappointing that we do not visit the RPD as Jill in this game, we do visit it as Carlos before the events of Resident Evil 2. This provides the opportunity to explain how certain things came to be, such as the damaged boiler and hole in the wall of the locker room, or the 2 dead officers near the beginning, with one hanging from a pipe. Let's face it, we all wondered how he got there when we first saw that in Resident Evil 2, and now we know it was a licker with a proclivity for decoration. Most importantly, we also get to see how Marvin was bitten in this version of the story. Though these minor details don't impact the story or gameplay experience all that much, I appreciate them as it paints a better picture of what was happening before Leon and Claire reached the city. And on that note, time for the next segment. The opening. Because this game doesn't have one. It has something that pretends to be one, but for me, fails miserably. Though it's extremely unlikely, imagine this is someone's first time experiencing anything Resident Evil. What information does this intro provide for us? Civil unrest? Vague mentions of a virus, a first-person sequence in a dark apartment. This unknown woman has a nightmare of turning into a zombie. Why? Then we find out the city's been taken over by the dead. How did she not know? Or if she did, why was she just chilling in her apartment? Nemesis then bursts through the wall like a furiously overenthusiastic Jehovah's Witness, and we're thrown into a chase sequence. There is no build-up and no context. So, how would I change it? First, start the game much like the original. Let's see the police and the UBCS versus the hordes of undead in the Raccoon City streets as they get overwhelmed. We then cut to Jill's apartment where she's either writing on paper or on a typewriter. We get her famous line from the original.
September 28th, daylight. The monsters have overtaken the city. Somehow, I'm still alive.
September 28th remains on screen before rolling back to September 24th. The next 4 days are covered with a mix of cutscenes and tutorial gameplay segments as Jill Valentine, STARS member, is helping the RPD contain the riots and violence when she discovers that this is no ordinary violence. This is exactly like the mansion incident. These are zombies. Many of these scenes could be adapted from many of the cutscenes found in the first Outbreak game, the military blockade, the zombies overrunning the streets. We find out in these brief scenes that ever since the mansion incident, Jill has been trying to hold Umbrella responsible, but it's been difficult. Her captain betrayed her team and was killed by the tyrant before the destruction of the mansion. Police Chief Irons is of no help due to his loyalty to Umbrella. With Chris, Barry and Rebecca all elsewhere working towards the same goal, Jill Valentine, plagued with nightmares and PTSD, is very much alone in a city owned by Umbrella. We return to September 28th. We assume control of Jill as she saves some survivors from the undead before running out of ammo. Cornered by the zombies, she plans her next move when Carlos guns them down. Much like in the game, he tells her about the subway safe house, or safe carriage more specifically, and asks for her help while providing ammo for her empty gun. She obliges. Much of the first section of the game would go here, looking for the hose, finding the shotgun, turning on the power, and so on. Once the power is back on, Brad would radio Jill to ask for help rescuing survivors. Jill would tell him about the train and they would meet up. The survivors would go on ahead to the subway, and just as Jill and Brad are about to join them, Nemesis appears and instantly kills him, standing between Jill and the access to the subway. This brings us nicely on to the second thing that needs changing. Nemesis. The game completely underutilizes him and spoils any kind of suspense or build-up by having him appear in the first 2 minutes of the game. From there, he's restricted to scripted events and a couple boss battles. He's treated more like a plot device than the scariest creature in Raccoon City. Changing how Nemesis is implemented would drastically change the overall quality and experience of the game, intimidating the player and producing an even greater paranoia than Mr. X did in Resident Evil 2. How do we change Nemesis? Well, we'll look at his purpose from a gameplay perspective. He should be a bombshell dropped on the player as soon as they're comfortable with how the game is played and enemies are defeated. He should catch the player off guard, then continue to challenge the player at every turn, both in terms of decision making and general skill. Think of him as the exam for the lessons the game will be teaching you. If the player isn't paranoid about when he's going to appear next, much like they were in Resident Evil 2's remake with Mr. X, then something's terribly wrong. Let's begin from that first encounter I set up earlier. The first encounter should be the one that forces the player to run. Regular weapons are not going to harm Nemesis, and grenades will only momentarily stun him for about 5 seconds. This induces fear in the player. They are no longer confident or comfortable because they aren't prepared for this. The safest option is to run. Once the player has escaped the scripted encounter, they should be more cautious with their gameplay, more conservative with ammo and health, just in case Nemesis appears again. And he will. I would implement an adaptive difficulty system. The chances of a random encounter with Nemesis would be proportional to how well the player is doing. Much like with Mr. X in Resident Evil 2, it would be possible to escape from these encounters, but like the original Resident Evil 3, fighting him would reward you with weapon parts and other items if you do manage to defeat him. Now the player will be paranoid, not knowing when the next encounter with this unstoppable behemoth will be. Of course, the player's combat options will balance out with access to grenades and weapon upgrades along with new weapons, like the grenade launcher. Once the player can fight even with Nemesis, another scripted boss fight should occur. This could be the battle with the flamethrower. After this encounter, Nemesis should be more resilient and slightly more aggressive, having subtly mutated in response to the damage. The random chance encounters would also continue based on player performance. The next main sequence would be with his rocket launcher. I would introduce this with the destruction of a rescue helicopter that gets blown to pieces by Nemesis. The player would have to dodge his rockets and physical attacks before blowing him up at the gas station and escaping. I would keep the train attack much the same, with Mikhail blowing up the carriage in an attempt to kill Nemesis. Either this explosion or the one at the gas station would trigger the loss of his power limiter and give way to Nemesis' second form from the original game. This is the form that would attack and inevitably infect Jill with the T-virus. This form would also run into Carlos while Jill is unconscious in the hospital. Carlos would use C4 or some other explosion to blow up Nemesis and have him fall into the river. I like the new form this remake introduced, so the fights with this form after the hospital would continue more or less as they do in the game. All of this would give the final boss fight with Nemesis, which I did rather enjoy despite its similarity to G5 Birkin at the end of RE2, far more impact. Nemesis will have been a thorn in your side throughout the entire experience, giving these lines from Jill much more weight.
Look, just so you know, this is the last fucking time. Come on! Next time, take the fucking hit!
Once you've shot Nemesis with the railgun and followed it up with some magnum shots to the head before finishing with this classic line,
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
would be far more cathartic after so many encounters with him instead of just the handful we actually got. The final change I would make is a minor, yet important one. Less rehashing. I understand making use of previously rendered assets like the RPD and some of the city streets. It makes sense, and it's likely that multiple characters will retrace each other's steps, but this becomes far more noticeable when areas from the original, such as the cemetery, do not appear in this game. A glaring example of this is the cutscene with Kendo, the gunsmith. It's almost the same scene from Resident Evil 2, just with Jill there instead of Leon and Ada. At least add something new, especially considering how he and Jill are shown to be friends. When we take a step back, this game follows the same sequence of set pieces as Resident Evil 2. The city, the sewer, the lab. Is it too much to ask for a little more variation? I would add more new areas to the game, and I would do more with the reused locations. This would give the city an even bigger, grander feel, and would leave the game feeling less rushed and empty. On that point, I'm assuming DLC is coming for the game, as we never see what happens between Jill receiving the vaccine and waking up. A wasted opportunity at the time of writing this video. And that's about it. There are many other things I could talk about for this game, and I do have other criticisms, but I'm limiting it to 3 things on either side of the review. Overall, I did enjoy playing the Resident Evil 3 remake, but it ultimately failed to live up to my expectations and left me feeling disappointed, which is a shame. But now, I turn it over to you. What did you like about the game? What didn't you like? Do you agree with my thoughts and proposed changes? or am I just a lunatic? Let me know in the comments below. And be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and I'll see you in the next review.